Thank you, Ms. Jill. Wanting to kind of tell everybody, I know it looks a little different, but I decided very late that I was going to alter my presentation just a little bit. I've changed it from just caretaking of Breslin Tower to caretaking tires collecting friends. I wanted to give a real good story. I've gained a lot of family through the NAWCC, pretty much, just a lot of it. But I want to start with the clock that got me here. In Sewanee, Tennessee, the university was founded 1858 by several Southern Episcopal dioceses, and they started in an old coal mining town. That's where my family came to this town about 200 years ago, and we've never left. One of the first kind of major buildings the university wanted to build was a library and clock tower. So they built on the left there is Convocation Hall, and that has been everything from a library to now special events. It is quite a beautiful building. And the clock tower has been everything from a library to offices to the university's main water tower. So the tower was completed in 1886. We would not see a clock for several years. They ran out of money a little too quickly. So here is this, the tower was erected in memory of Lucy, the daughter of Thomas and Elizabeth Breslin. She was 7 years old and she passed away, and they wanted to do this in her memory. A few years later, in 1900, late 1899, the university and the Douglas family contacted Seth Thomas to add a clock and chimes to the tower, and they wanted this for their 59th anniversary of the marriage of Charlotte Douglas. The clock itself they wanted to put in was a number 16 with Westminster chime on it. They used 4 bells from the McNeely Foundry in Troy, New York. Odd little story, every person who has donated to the tower and the clock to get it started, they were all from New York. Every single one. After the clock's install, we really don't know anything about who was caretaker or what happened to it until about the early 1930s, when I actually found a university document between the university and Seth Thomas asking to install some mercury switch winders to the clock. But around that time, we finally have our first caretaker for the tower and the clock itself. His name was Dr. Fritz Weitzel. He was the university's German teacher and also quite a major clock repairman for the surrounding communities. Dr. Weitzel would actually be our longest, to date, our longest caretaker of 50 years. Here's an article the university used to put out called the Sewanee News. This was one of the best pictures of Fritz. He was always known for having a pipe, and he was also known, he loved oiling the clock. If you look at the Texaco oiler that he had from the 30s. So for several years, he was caretaker for the clock, and around in the late 70s, early 80s, the university acquired a new registrar. His name was Paul Ingsberg, and his parents came from Germany, so very quickly, both families being German, Fritz roped Paul into being caretaker pretty quick. So while Paul was registrar, he would actually go from, this is the chapel of our university up there in Sewanee. He would actually take trips back and forth every year to Durham Cathedral and help with the college at Durham every year. And we had in 1999, the clock stopped. As a matter of fact, one of the first times that it stopped for the longest time was in February, right at, going to be close to 100 years of the clock. And so there was an assistant caretaker at that time. His name was Wilbur Mills. And he had to call Paul while he was over in England and said, "Paul, the clock stopped. I don't know what to do." So after some calling around, they found the NAWCC website and found a chapter down in Huntsville, Alabama. So they had two engineers come up. They were a guy by the name of Ed Foxworthy and Walt Wilson come up to do the first checking on the clock. Here's a picture of the three of them, Walt, Paul, and Ed. This is when Paul had just gotten back from one of his trips. So this was what Walt and Ed saw when they first got there. Got to take a picture of the tower and got to almost sue the university for slipping on oil underneath the clock. So they stayed for a whole weekend watching the clock and taking out different parts, checking to see. They said there were several worn bushings, and this was some of our members visiting them that day. As you can see, we still have Fritz's oil can with us today. And come to find out, the main drive of the clock actually had one of the worst bushings. Here's Ed showing Will what they were wanting to try to do, take it apart, have some new bushings made. And come to find out, at that time, Walt Wilson had quite a good machining set up at his house. So Will agreed to give them the parts, and Walt took it back and made several new bushings for it, got the clock back in order. There was still, as Walt would call it, a little gremlin in the clock, stopping it. But after getting the main clock fixed, they come to find out the east clock face, the motion works, had actually worn so much. They were sitting up there talking, and in Walt's words, he was just sitting there playing with the drive shaft of the clock and spinning it. And about 3 minutes later, it spun and he heard click, and it stopped. The bushing for the minute hand had actually worn just enough that it would lay on the hour hand only when the wind was just right. So it was, thank goodness Walt got bored, we found out what was wrong with it. So that was able to be taken out and repaired later on. And Walt, if anybody would like to see it, this is the article that Walt wrote for the bulletin from April of 2002. If anybody would like to read the full article, it is quite something else. So after that happened, everything calmed down. Paul would go on some more trips after that. Pretty soon after this, actually. He would sit outside during lunch and he would hear bells in the cathedral. And after a couple of days, he finally caught a ringer coming down, and they allowed Paul to go up and ring change ringing bells. Paul had never heard them before, but after only twice up there, he was quoted coming down saying, "We must have bells in Sewanee." So almost less than a year later, we have a nice lady, Donna Lee Bentley Wright, and her husband Spencer actually wanted to donate some money to the university in the name of her parents, Mildred and George Bentley. And the university was quoted as saying, "Please give your money to Paul Ingsberg. I want him to stop calling my phone." So, in a very short period of time, the clock had stopped. Paul met Walt in Chapter 61 of Huntsville. A year later, they were back again. Paul had gotten the money for 8 change ringing bells to be installed and needed Walt and everybody to come back, kind of package the clock up while the tower was getting a complete overhaul. So here's a few pictures of what Walt and them, the faces, as soon as they were even touched, they were old glass and chicken wire, and as soon as they were touched, they fell in a million pieces. But as some of you can see, the clock was in dire need of a little bit of repair anyway. There was more paint on the brass than there was anywhere else. And everybody who had been kind of taught how to oil the clock, if the clock gave any problems, pour oil on every gear that it had. So all the parts, except for the main movement, were pretty much removed, taken down to be cleaned by Walt and Preston. And this is after the bells had been installed. Here comes Walt and Preston back, slowly unpackaging the movement and the winders again. And here's a good picture. That's Walt on the right and Preston Jett on the left. This was 2004, just finally getting the clock back installed. Another one of Walt giving. The Whitechapel, who made the change ringing bells, actually sent us up extra ironwork to add for the 4 o'clock bells. And about the time that the clock was ready to have the dials put back on, the change ringing bells, that's all of these ropes here, were installed. And my mentor, Paul Ingsberg, would always stop everybody and say, "I just learned something new, let me show you." So here is a picture of the 8 change ringing bells, and I'll kind of go over a little bit. Change ringing comes from England from about the 15th century. It was a way of bells were technically turned text messages. You could ring the bells a certain way and pretty much send any message you wanted to for births, deaths, weddings. When they come up with the idea, they had 2 things added to the bells here. This is called a stay, and I've got another picture a little bit better, but there's a board at the bottom that just slides left or right. The English devised this way that you can raise these bells to where they are mouth up, and every time you pull a rope, they swing around 360 degrees, ringing at each one. You would hear these bells struck mouth down probably only about 2 miles away, in Sewanee, we've had these bells heard between 5 and 7 miles away because of that. These are the weights of the bells that we ring. So you can just imagine the wheels that they have made actually make it to where bell number 1, 412 pounds, its wheel is 3 feet in diameter. The tenor, 1,255, has a 6-foot diameter wheel. And I've actually gotten the privilege to teach a very nice 12-year-old lady how to ring bell number 8. So here's what they look like in the up position. So the stay is sitting against the slider board down here. So each time you pull the rope, it only rings one time. So we cannot ring a tune or a melody. So what they come up with is ringing all the bells in a sequence. So if we had 4 people and we were ringing, you'd hear 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we would make a change and change positions of the bells. You would hear 1, 2, 3, 4. Next, you'd hear 1, 3, 2, 4. So it's all mathematical. Every combination that the bells could move into, 1 through 8, which is around 3,500 changes, we can do that while we're ringing. We had some very nice Society of English Scholars come over, and that's all them right there. They rang our first, rang the bells for really the first time with 8 people. And Paul giving everybody else after they rang a little tour afterwards. So I was talking a little bit about mathematics. So when they come up with ringing, here's how we see ringing. We just see it as the numbers moving around. So we call the blue line is bell number 1. So every time we pull on a rope, bell number 1 is constantly moving. This is called hunting to the back and forth, back and forth. And each time that bell number 1's moving, all the other ones are moving as well. So you can ring for 3.5 solid hours and never hear a bell strike in the same position. It is really quite amazing what they've done. So everything was installed back, except for one part. They did not have the clock bells reinstalled. So here's where I come in. I started in 2005 just by a happy mistake. I climbed up the tower, I heard the bells ringing, and I just saw the lights being turned back on in the clock faces. I tried to be very quiet, but as soon as the top of my hat hit the top of the steps, I heard Paul Lingsberg yell across the room while 8 people are ringing, "Please come up, see what we're doing." And I ended up everybody stayed 3 hours after practice. And I learned everything about the clock, the history of the entire tower, and that was something else. So I got to, first thing I started with, I was working with Preston Jett, and he brought me up. This is the first day I was there. He said, "We need to make tables for all the hammers." And so my first job was holding a plumb bob around each one of the bells so that he could draw the bells and everything out on the floor before he would even cut the first board. So it took several trips up there. We got the strike working first. We built its table first, and these are after we finished every single one of them. I kind of see why he wanted the strike completed first. I can tell y'all a little funny story. I was finishing helping him draw out for the other 3 hammers, and he had me under bell number 4 when it struck 12 o'clock on a Saturday. So this was extremely fun several weekends. So when I first went up into the tower, this was a little off to a side story. I met 5 people in less than 1 month. These are all NAWCC members. Preston I met pretty much the first time I went up there. And less than a week later, Walt and Joanne Wilson came up. I got to meet them. Miss Joanne there, sadly she has passed away now, but she was the first person to say, you are to join the NAWCC. And I will always remember that. The week after that, I got the greatest privilege, the man who's sitting in the room in here, I got to meet Jim and Renee Coulson, who pretty much welcomed me into their house and said, you've got to learn more about the NAWCC. So I got to meet some great people literally my first month of learning about clocks at all. So we all kind of met and helping with them since 2008. And in 2011, Mr. Paul Ingsberg had passed away after a short time with cancer, and I became the only caretaker for the tower in only a few years. But we named the room that the clock and the bells are in, we named it after Paul. So with Walt and Jim's help, I'll show you the next, my next project was the clock didn't really go under a dramatic cleaning. Everything outside the clock did, so I'd kind of been working with taking everything apart. About once a year I'll take half of the clock apart and just kind of clean, oil it, bring some new life into it. A couple of years ago had the lifting lever for the strike. I came up, this one has a little bit of sound to it. I came up, somebody said, I didn't hear the clock ring the other day. And the arm had worn so badly that every other strike you could not hear a single thing. So Jim Coulson had a very nice engineer who he helped me do some re-welding. We ended up having to add over 1/4 inch of steel to it. That's how bad it had worn in 100 years. And now it runs absolutely perfect. Kind of the next big project that hit Breslin Tower was I was working on some of the winders. How I was taught was that the transmission of the winders, I would take a tongue depressor and just wipe all the black mess out of these transmissions and pretty much take a 1940s 1-gallon Texaco grease can and just pack them as tight as as I could. That's how I was kind of first taught. But I wrote this October of 2023 in our bulletin, how a Model A, I was helping kind of restore a Model A Ford, and I was literally reading about what Ford used on everything, what oils, what grease, and the transmission had a 600 weight oil in it. Just so happens that I was cleaning one of the transmissions from the clock. I was cleaning it at my house, and that grease was only, I'd actually just changed this one less than a month ago, and that's what it looked like. So I had them both kind of there working on it. I literally had that right there and looked up and saw the Ford spec sheet. And I thought, wait a minute, this is a transmission, almost same like what would be a Ford. I know it's a worm geared, but so there was an extra of these transmissions up in the clock tower, and nobody almost ever opened it. I ran up the clock tower that day and actually had found Seth had put oil in the bottom of it. And I thought, wow, this is what you're actually supposed to use in it. So I did a cleaning on it, and actually had bought some 600 weight oil from a company that helps remake Ford's original oil and grease, and was able to get it looking like that only after about a couple of days. It was a very, very, very fun project there. And I've sent for Chuck Rozier, helped me rebushing a couple of parts for the motion works and the gear drives. So that's, Breslin's been staying pretty busy these past 20 years getting some updates. So Sewanee now has a second tower clock in it, and I've kind of called it the Traveling 15 over the years. This courthouse you see right here is in West Union, Ohio. They purchased a Seth Thomas number 15 in 1915. And it was installed in the courthouse there, ran very well for many, many years. All of it was completely original. It was still hand wound once a week until 1975. The courthouse had a remodel and probably said, why do we need a mechanical clock? We just need to throw this away. And it was literally put into a garbage dumpster like that. And literally what is up there now is just one single box with a 1 revolution per hour motor is all that sits in that tower today. So that clock was actually saved by a man by the name of Paul Gamble. His brother lived just down the road and called and said, Paul, they're taking your clock down and throwing it in the garbage. He said, I'll be right up there. So Paul made several trips up there to get the clock, all of the weights. The weights, there were 14 100-pound weight bars for the strike, and for the running they had 20-pound round weights, and there were about 8 to 10 of them. So he was able to get all of them out of there before they got damaged. So this is Paul Gamble right here. He kept it for several years, and a good friend of his that everybody recognizes in the picture here as well, Jim Coulson, had kept up with him and found out and said, if you ever want to sell that, I want you to let me know. So they kept in touch for several years till about 85, which year I was born, and they made an agreement. Paul was wanting some money for one of his grandkids to go off to college. He finally called Jim and said, Jim, I think I'm ready to sell that clock. He said, when can I be there? So Miss Jim and his Mercury car took 3 trips back and forth to get the clock. And that's why I've been calling it the Traveling 15, because it's been in the Seth Thomas factory in Connecticut, to Ohio, to then it was moved to Tennessee in Chattanooga. Then from Chattanooga to Ottawa is the first part of its story here. So anybody who's gotten to visit Jim's house, this is how I got to know the clock. Jim and Renee would have New Year's Day parties. And me not liking crowds so much, I'd always say, "Where's Keith at?" "Oh, he's down there where the tower clock's at," where he always is. Jim and Renee would come down and see where I was. So here's the first time I had ever gotten to see the clock. This is in Jim's basement. And just amazing. I would sit down there and me and Jim would talk for hours on the history of this clock. And I got a phone call on Jim's 70th birthday saying, I think I'd like to sell it. Would you like to buy it?" And I said, "Well, I'm building a house. I think I could build my house around it." So I made a trip up there and moved with it. This was in 2012. So since I had a chance to build it, my house wasn't done yet, so I put it on an enclosed back porch at my mother's house until I could get a chance to move it. And this is inside the house. I thought I would really like to have the clock hanging from the ceiling, pretty much. I'd like the 3 dials to be hanging from the ceiling. And so I installed some beams to start that, and had a nice neighbor of mine, Sonny O'Neill. This is the box that he helped me build for the 3 clock faces. So it's just, that was kind of, this whole thing was about, it's amazing how clocks, watches, tower clocks, you create a family of 5 million friends just with what we're doing here. So I kind of wanted to go old-fashioned with everything. So I literally hoisted that box up by myself one evening with ratchet straps, just one after the other, getting it up to the ceiling and getting it stained and painted. The dials, the 3 dials that are here, were actually found by Jim under a table at a mart. And there was a total of 4, and I've actually now got all 4 dials of the same set. They're 32-inch dials. But the timing ended up just right. In March of 2015, Jim and Renee come up and handed me a birthday card because the clock turned 100 years old the first day they come up. I thought that's amazing how the timing worked out. We had several of our ringers and other members of chapters from around the Tennessee area came up for its birthday. The Traveling 15 was not finished yet. It had moved to Sewanee, but then the next year it went to, this is a museum called the Burritt Museum in Huntsville, Alabama. I moved the clock down there. We had a museum exhibit, and I mainly wanted to show that because we had the entire museum exhibit was in the memory of Miss Joanne Wilson. She had passed away the year before, and I thought we're going to bring as much stuff as we can because it's for Joanne. And then everything always goes in a full circle. Always seems to go full circle. So after getting to know Jim and Renee, Walt, Joanne, Preston. All three of us, Walt, Preston, and me, got back together. Chapter 61 Huntsville, we went down to Birmingham at an estate sale and actually bought this tower clock. We do not know its exact age. We're thinking 1880s or 1890s. It was restored and said restored 1939 by J. Smith and Sons of Clerkenwell, London. So we had an idea that what if we, for the next year, 2023, if we could get it ready to put it in the Mid-South Regional. So we all, the whole group had gotten together, all of Chapter 61 thought, let's build a tower. Let's have a full tower and let the entire chapter get together. We'll all work together and get this clock running. The day we bought it, there literally were just pieces laying all around this workshop. And we were actually able to find all of the pieces, not even putting it together that day. But there was only one piece that had to be remanufactured. It was one tiny little gear. That was the only thing missing from this clock. So that was great. After 16 years, there is Preston, Walt, and myself. We finally all we had not been in the same room for those 16 years, had not seen each other at all. But clocks brought us back together again. And this was our exhibit in the Mid-South 2023. And every bit of the wood, everything was donated by our members. Me, Walt, and Preston worked on the main clock, but all of our other members, woodworkers, most of the parts you see were actually 3D printed to put on this tower. So it was quite fun, and well, try not to get emotional about something, but it's amazing it brought us all together for another fun adventure. So thank y'all so much.